We are finally ready to write our first query, and in the process we will keep exploring the fantastic BigQuery interface. So one way to get started would be to click this plus symbol over here so that we can open a new tab. Now, to write the query, the first thing I will do is to tell BigQuery where the data that I want lives. And to do that, I will use the from clause. So I will simply write from, and my data lives in the fantasy dataset and in the characters table. Next, I will tell SQL what data I actually want from this table, and the simplest thing to ask for is to get all the data. And I can do this by writing select star. Now my query is ready, and I can either click run up here, or I can press Command Enter on my Mac keyboard, and the query will run, and here I get a new tab which shows me the results. Now the results here are displayed as a table, just as we saw in the preview tab of the table, and I can get an idea of my results, and this is actually the whole table because this is what I asked for in the query. There are also other ways to see the results which are provided by BigQuery, such as JSON, which shows the same data but in a different format, but we're not going to be looking into that for this course. One cool option that the interface provides is if I click on this arrow right here in my tab, I can select split tab to right, and now I have a bit of less room in my interface, but I'm seeing the table on the left and the query on the right, so that I can look at the structure of the table while writing my query. For example, if I click on schema here, I could see which columns I'm able to reference in my query, and that can be pretty handy. I could also click this toggle to close the Explorer tab temporarily if I don't need to look at those tables, so I can make a bit more room, or I can reactivate it when needed. I will now close this tab over here, go back to the characters table, and show you another way that I can write a query, which is to use this query command over here. So if I click here, I can select whether I want my query in a new tab or in a split tab. Let me say in new tab. And now BigQuery has helpfully written a template for a query that I can easily modify in order to get my data. And to break down this template, as you can see, we have the select clause that we used before, we have the from clause, and then we have a new one called limit. Now the from clause is doing the same job as before. It is telling BigQuery where we want to get our data. But you will notice that the address looks a bit different from the one that I had used. Specifically, I used the address fantasy.characters. So what's happening here is that fantasy.characters is a useful shorthand for the actual address of the table. And what we see here that BigQuery provided is the actual full address of the table, or in other words, it is the table ID. And as you remember, the table ID indicates the project ID, the dataset name, and the table name. And importantly, this ID is usually enclosed by backticks, which are a quite specific character. Long story short, if you want to be 100% sure, you can use the full address of the table and BigQuery will provide it for you. But if you are working within the same project where the data lives, so you don't need to reference the project, you can also use this shorthand here to make writing the address easier. And in this course, I will use these two ways to reference a table interchangeably. I will now keep the address that BigQuery provided, Now the limit statement, as we will see, is simply limiting the number of rows that will be returned by this query. No more than 1000 rows will be returned. And next to the select, we have to say what data we want to get from this table. And like before, I can write star, and now my query will be complete. Before we run our query, I want to draw your attention to this message over here. This query will process 1 kilobyte when run. So this is very important because here BigQuery is telling you how much data will be scanned in order to give you the results of this query. In this case, we are returning all the data in the table. Therefore, all of the table will be scanned. And actually, limit does not have any influence on that. It doesn't reduce how much data is scanned. So this query will scan 1 kilobyte of data. And the amount of data that is scanned by the query is the primary determinant of BigQuery costs. Now, as you remember, we are able to scan up to 1 terabyte of data each month within the Sandbox program. And if we wanted to scan more data, then we would have to pay. So the question is, how many of these queries could we run before running out of our free allowance? Well, to answer that, we could check how many kilobytes are in a terabyte. And if you Google this, the conversion says it's 1 to multiplied by 10 to the power of 9, which ends up being 1 billion. Therefore, we can run 1 billion of these queries each month before running out of our allowance. Now you understand why I've told you that as long as you work with small tables, you won't really run out of your allowance and you don't really have to worry about costs. However, here's an example of a query that will scan a large amount of data. And what I've done here is I've taken one of the public tables provided by BigQuery, which I've seen to be quite large, and I have told BigQuery to get me all the data for this table. And as you can see here, BigQuery says that 120 gigabytes of data will be processed once this query runs. Now, you would need about 8 of these queries to get over your free allowance. And if you had billing connected to BigQuery, you could also be charged money for any extra work that you do. So be very careful about this. And if you work with large tables, always check this message over here before running the query. And remember, you won't actually be charged until you actually hit run on the query. And there you have it. We learned how the BigQuery interface works and wrote our first SQL query.